Good morning, brethren. Welcome to Daily Devotions this morning. I want us to think this morning about what Paul writes in Philippians chapter 1 and verse number 12 and following, looking at over the next few days. I wonder if you ever said to yourself, or maybe said to somebody else, life's not fair. If you haven't said it, I wonder, have you maybe at times thought it? Probably most of us have felt a bit like that at some time or another in our lives. Maybe whenever things in life didn't work out the way we wanted them to work out. Maybe whenever things went terribly wrong and we found ourselves facing really awful, difficult circumstances. Maybe your reaction at the time was, I don't deserve this. Why is God allowing this to happen to me? Maybe you thought, if God really loved me, would he let this happen? And all our troubles that we were going through maybe produced in us a spirit of complaining, moaning. Maybe we had a bit of a pity party. Certainly at those times, it's very easy to lose the sense of peace and contentment and a sense of joy in our Christian lives. Earlier on in these studies in Philippians, I said that joy was one of the overriding themes of this book. And the Apostle Paul was able to rejoice no matter what his circumstances were. The reason for that was that his joy wasn't rooted in his circumstances, but rather was rooted in God. As well as that, Paul had a firm belief in the doctrine of God's sovereignty. God was in complete control of his circumstances. Not just things that went on in general, but even in the very specifics of his circumstances, including when he got into difficulties. He knew the truth of Psalm 31 and verse 15. My times are in your hands. And that comes out very clearly in this section that we're going to look at this week. In verse 12 of chapter 1, Paul writes, I want you to know, brethren, that the things that have happened unto me have worked out for the furtherance of the gospel. Now, it's interesting that Paul doesn't go into detail here with regards to the things that he was going through or the things that had happened to him since he left Philippi. The Philippians had heard that Paul had gone through some terrible experiences, and they had sent Epaphroditus to try and find out how he was. And in verse 12, Paul addresses their concerns. But the way in which he addresses those concerns is instructive, because rather than going into all the details of the hardships that he faced since he left them, he doesn't give any specific information. All he says is, I want you to know that what has happened to me. He could have used gallons of ink writing in detail about everything that he suffered. And sometimes we're a bit like that. If we find ourselves in hardships, we love to tell people and we love to give them all the details to, as it were, draw out their sympathy and pity for us. Paul doesn't do that. All he says is the things that have happened unto me. There is a considerable degree of measured restraint here in the way in which he informs them of the fact that he has had hardships. He doesn't indulge himself in a list of personal woes. The fact of the matter was quite a bit had happened to Paul. And you only have to read in the book of Acts to discover some of the terrible things that he experienced. But when you think of the fact that he did go through all of these things, if anyone had a right to say life's not fair, surely it was Paul. If anyone was entitled to throw a pity party and whinge to others about the awful things that had happened to him, it was this man. If anyone had the right to complain that life was treating him badly, it was Paul. But Paul doesn't whinge. He doesn't complain. He doesn't wallow in self-pity. He doesn't throw the head up and say the things that happened to me have put me off Christianity forever. In fact, he rejoices, as we're going to go and see. He doesn't rejoice in the fact that he's had to experience those things, but he rejoices in the midst of those things. The whole tenor of this section of this letter is that of rejoicing. And despite the personal hardships that he was currently facing, because don't forget, he was writing from a prison, he's actually rejoicing. How do we explain that? Well, we explain it because Paul rejoices not in his hardships as such, but in what those hardships have achieved. The things that have happened unto me have worked out for the furtherance of the gospel. We'll look at that in a moment, or in our study tomorrow. But let's take this point with us today, folks. We are going to face hardships. We are going to face times when life deals us a very bad hand, so to speak. Times when there's going to be real difficulties and hardships and pain and suffering. Do we believe, as Paul did, our times are in God's hands? Do we believe God is sovereign? Is our joy rooted in God as opposed to rooted in our daily circumstances? Paul did have a lot of things that happened to him, but as we're going to see, he was able to rejoice in them because he knew that his circumstances were under the control of his sovereign God. May God help us to reflect on this and to use it to our spiritual profit throughout the rest of the day. May the Lord be with you.